my name's Xan Phillips and welcome to Your Green Voice, and welcome to Rushmere Farm. It's on the South Downs in the middle of Hampshire in the United Kingdom, and over the last 5 years it's become organic. The farmer, George Crossley, took over from his father and has recently published a blog suggesting that now is the time for everyone to start thinking about turning their farms organic because of the crisis in the Middle East, the fact that prices of diesel and fertiliser have gone up, and maybe they should follow his example and all other organic farmers' example and ditch the chemicals and feed people properly. George, welcome to the show. And it was a gamble going organic. You went against your family traditions, so to speak. So is there a certain feeling of justification at the moment with the way the situation is?
I can't pretend I'm not feeling a bit smug. Yeah, very, very difficult situation for farmers who are very diesel and fertiliser dependent at the moment, with very high fertiliser prices and even lack of availability. And we're self-sufficient, so we don't need to buy fertiliser. We do buy a bit of diesel, but we're not doing nearly as many passes as most people have to do. So during this part of the year, we're really just waiting for things to grow. Whereas conventional farmers will be doing passes with their fertiliser spreaders and sprayers. So
because you put some costs into your blog, and it's definitely the spreading, the product, the passes, as you say, this sort of repeat spraying and the chemicals is where you're saving money. And for some farmers, though, they're saying they don't want to plant, they can't afford to plant. So obviously we're very sympathetic to that, but is that now an opportunity for the country to start thinking that this is a crisis that might get resolved but might come back again? Should we start thinking of not using fertiliser and going back to more conventional farming before chemicals were involved?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't the first time it's happened. When the Ukraine war kicked off, fertiliser prices went up to above £800 a tonne. There was unavailability for a short time. We've recovered to a point where we're kind of, where we were at below £500 a tonne. But even that is, it's very expensive. You need to be producing a pretty high, substantial yield to be getting that money back. And I think, it might be fine. It might be fine in a couple of years. It might not be. But to be stable is, I think, just a better way to run a business.
Because yield, you mentioned yield, and that's very interesting. Am I right in saying or thinking that a field, when chemicals are added to it, produces 40% more than an organic field?
So in most, I think probably in most situations, you can apply fertiliser to soil and significantly boost your yield. As long as your soil is, still a media in which you can hold a plant, you can add fertiliser and increase yields. As an organic farmer, we typically produce significantly lower yields than a conventional farmer. But in order to be profitable, we don't need to grow so much food. The argument is always, well, don't we need to feed the world? And the answer is the world has more than enough food already to feed the population in about 25 years' time. And what we should be concentrating on is being food secure. Maybe selfishly for the UK, I think, as an island, we need to be food secure. And as you say, I think it's time for government really to think, well, this is this is a dangerous spot we're in. If a big proportion of farmers say, well, we're not planting any spring crops because we can't afford to, then that's a significant drop in our production. And this is just the beginning of a war. We might end up in a situation where we can't buy in food from elsewhere, let alone the fertiliser. So, yeah, it's a very difficult decision for a farmer to make. But if the government can drive that, incentivise moving towards an organic or a semi-organic system that's less reliant on imports, I think we're going to set us up for a safer future.
Well, we're talking, this conversation is April 2026. I can imagine it's too late to get everyone planting different crops and saying to everyone, go organic, or at least start the preparation for going organic. So I'm right in thinking it's 2 years it takes before someone can be registered as organic. So if a farmer was to say, right, I'm not going to put fertiliser, chemicals onto my field, what options have they got? And what options, in some respects, have the government got to encourage them to do, to take a better approach to farming in, let's say, 2 to 3 years' time?
So, if they've still got to buy their fertiliser now, they're probably thinking, well, it's too expensive, and I'm never going to make that money back. If they bought their fertiliser before the crisis, they're probably in a situation where they will make it work this year. In terms of options, because the organic conversion period is 2 years, so the trouble is, at this point you can't just say, right, I'm not going to use fertiliser and then expect to get organic prices on your crop. If you didn't use fertiliser and sold crop at conventional prices, you're not gonna get the yield you need to cover your costs. So if you wanted to go along the journey of right, I want to be organic in two years' time, I'd probably suggest that you invest a minimal cost in seeding that ground that you might have otherwise seeded with spring barley with herbal ley, which will build the fertility in your soil. Maybe you could plant a legume like a spring pea. It probably isn't too late for that, as long as we get a bit of rain. And then you've got a crop that doesn't need nitrogen applied. It fixes its own, and you can make a profit from that, selling it as cattle feed or there's various options for depending on the variety that you grow. But I think I do think the government would probably need to step in and say, right, I think they need to be asking questions and they need to know that farmers have made the decision not to plant food. I expect they are somewhat aware of the supply they need within the country. I'm not really sure how government policy works, but they need to be worried, I think, if a lot of farmers aren't planting crops, which is what a lot of farmers I've seen on social media have been saying.
Because actually, only 2%, I think I'm right in saying 2% of farming is organic or traditional. The rest is chemical, 98% is chemical. This is something we talked about before when you said there's organic food should be just considered as food and everything else should be considered as chemical food.
Yeah.
So when you went organic, there were a couple of examples of you being under pressure to potentially go and get some chemicals and solve your insect problems, or necessarily at least one insect problem. but also potentially another problem with the earth. And I think we'll go off and have an investigate of that, if you don't mind, because that's something we should have a look at in the field as opposed to sitting here on your truck. George, we're on one of your fields, and in the middle actually of the field, and it's a very interesting contrast here, because on the left we can see what looks like grass, traditional grass, and on the right we've got crop. Can you tell the viewer what exactly is going on here?
So we've got a crop of wheat planted here on the right. This is actually a heritage wheat variety, great for baking. On the left we've got a wildflower strip, or some people will call that a beetle bank. It's basically designed to be a habitat for all kinds of things, but in particular we're interested in predatory insects, so insects that would predate on insects that might be damaging our crop, pests.
Fantastic. And this is part of the organic way of life, that you let nature grow over here, and it can help in here.
That's the plan. Yeah. So we don't have the use of pesticides. So we try to provide as much for nature as we can, so that nature can help manage our system. And in this field we've gone possibly a little bit overboard, but we've got strips every 60 metres, because certain insects will only travel 30 metres in a day, according to research. So if we've got strips on both sides of a 60-metre area of crop, we've got the whole thing covered. We don't want to have an island in the middle of a vast open field that isn't predated by the spiders and the things that we need.
And this is fascinating to me, because obviously standing here I can't see an insect anywhere. So you're totally satisfied. There's a whole army of helpers in there, and there's a rapid supply of food in here.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think if we pick under some of these tufts in this grass, we'll find at least some grubs or a beetle or a ladybird or something.
Now, I was with you the other day, and you mentioning tufts of grass reminds me of a story you told about how you were ploughing, and then tufts of weeds were popped up, and then the birds got involved. Can you just repeat that story for us?
It's quite. I put it on my Instagram the other day. It's quite sort of serendipitous, and I guess a nice synergistic relationship between all of the nature going on in this field. So for the farmers out there who might be interested in this, for anyone, we've ploughed this. So we ploughed to bury our fertility building ley. So in our fertility building ley we've got grasses and clovers and all sorts of things which are helping to improve the soil health. We leave that in for 2-3 years, and then we plough it over, so we don't have the use of a herbicide to get rid of those grasses. So we plough it over to create a nice seed bed for our crop to go into in its first year after fertility building. When we bury all that stuff, it means that we don't have any competition from those what would now be weeds in our crop. The problem that we created for ourselves is that we use contractors. Contractors need to cover a lot of ground in a lot of time to make their finances work, so they have big tractors. Big tractors means a lot of weight, so behind the wheels you need to lift that compaction, so we often have 2 big tines behind the wheel, so bits of steel which lift the ground. Unfortunately, that meant we lifted a lot of the weeds that we'd buried, so we had all these lush green tufts of grass and clover on the surface. So then,
can you show us one?
So they've all dried out now, but these were pulled out these were green and lush, and so we pulled them out. So there's rows of these behind where the wheels had gone when we drilled the crop, and so the next thing we would do is roll. So we roll the field to create good soil seed contact, so that the seed is surrounded by a nice tilth in which it will grow. If you don't roll it, you don't necessarily get that, and you don't trap in the moisture, and you risk other pests getting in there and eating your seed, one of which would be rooks. They love to, very clever, and they'll go along a row and they'll pick out every little seed. They can, in their hundreds, they could easily clear a field of seed. But the question was, do we want to roll? Because if we roll all these tufts back in, they'll grow again. Anyway, swings and roundabouts, we decided we'd roll it. And so all these tufts were squidged back in, and they will be competition to our crop. So one evening I was out here and it was completely flat, and then the next morning I was out here and there's about 300 rooks, and all of these tufts had been plucked out, lifted out by the rooks. I'd come out with a gas gun to make sure they didn't eat the wheat, and I looked in the binoculars and they were turning over all these tufts and pecking out the grubs and bugs and all the little things, tasty things in there. So I guess, and now these tufts, as you can see, the field's looking quite rough, much rougher than we would normally like it, but all these tufts are now dried out on the surface and won't be an issue competing with our crop. So big thanks to the rooks, and a nice little story that illustrates that having a nice complete ecosystem can be really beneficial. And so we distracted those corvids with tasty bugs, because they're here, they're happy, they're living in our organic system.
Yes, I can imagine a bug is much tastier than a seed in many respects.
Yeah, nice and soft and tender and full of protein. Delicious.
But this is part of what I see as it's a very interesting juxtaposition, because there's you being tense and nervous about nature, and at the moment what people call the conventional farmer, but let's call them the chemical farmer, is now tense and nervous about the geopolitical situation, and thinking that if they say goodbye to the chemicals, then they've got to deal with nature, which is in a way quite a little bit ironic in some respects, because that's what nature seems to understand what it's doing.
Yeah, I mean, nature's been growing food for a long time, so yeah, it's definitely you have to lose an element of control, which is scary, and we definitely faced a few times where we've been like, oh God, if only we could get back in control and use a pesticide or some herbicide or even a bit of fertiliser, that could be handy. But then once you relieve yourself of that necessity for complete control and rely a little bit more on nature, you realise that actually it's kind of got your back. I think there's so many little examples of things where we thought, God, this is going to be a disaster, and it's fine.
I think the aphid story on your peas was a particular favourite of mine.
Yeah.
You got time to go take us through that again?
Yeah, that was a good one. Because Dad had been out walking the dog and seen that there was loads of aphids on the peas, and they were really sucking the life out of all the peas, and thousands, millions of them. And he said we should probably, we need to do. He's getting really twitchy. His agronomist would have advised him to do probably 2 passes with the sprayer to kill the aphids. But we, being certified organic, we sat tight, and we had to. No, we didn't really have an option. other than picking them off with our fingers, but that would have taken a while. And yeah, 2 days later, along come just an enormous army of ladybirds, and just ate all the aphids. But I don't know where they came from. I hadn't noticed that it was a particularly busy year for ladybirds, and yeah, they just dealt with the problem.
Yeah, that's what I find so remarkable about this story, is that there's a flock of ladybirds, or whatever swarm of ladybirds, and they knew where to go, and it's it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I just absolutely love it. And
yeah, it's with the rook example, you can see that as soon as those seeds start shooting, they know exactly where to go. They're under the ground, but they know they need to be there.
Well, so this is, I mean, we can hear birds tweeting away. The fact that you're organic, has that brought more wildlife into your farm? Have you noticed? Because you grew up on the farm. Does there seem to be more wildlife here now?
Yeah, definitely. I think the most obvious indicator is the number of birds of prey. So we've got 4 barn owls now on our 300 acres, where we never had any before. We've had buzzards and kites and things that cover a big area, but these are covering a smaller area, and we know that they're covering our fields, and we know that if there's that many big predators, apex predators, there must be a lot of food down below them in the triangle of the ecosystem. As well as seeing bugs and beetles and voles and stuff. I think that's a really good indicator.
So final question then, it's a fairly obvious one. If I was a chemical farmer watching this, what advice would you give to them as to thinking about the next steps and preparing for potentially ditching the chemicals?
I think I'd just say that, I totally understand that in some systems it's really hard to change, and I do understand also that people are working extremely hard and long hours all the time, and it's hard really to stop and think about it. And this situation that we're in, it's quite likely that it'll get better and we'll find a temporary solution, but it's temporary, and this war isn't it's not the only thing that's going to impact our harvest. It might impact it this year or next year. Our soil is our biggest asset. We can't, we need to be looking after it. And I know people are moving towards regenerative farming, using less fertiliser. But I think this is a really good point to just stop and think, well, do I really need it? We're profitable. We're more profitable than we were when we farmed with chemicals. You have to sit on your hands sometimes and be a bit more relaxed about weeds and bugs and things like that. But we produce good quality, reasonably high yielding crops that are high value, and we can do so without any significant impact from outside vulnerabilities. We don't need to bring in inputs, and our externalities are minimal. We don't have runoff of chemicals into watercourses. Our water company loves us. They are saving, every ton of fertiliser that doesn't get put on, they're happy about. I think I know it's difficult, but I think that this is a time to think about long-term sustainability and what food security really means to you.
Well, George Crossley from Rushmere Farm, thank you very much for speaking with us.
My pleasure.